Before the wheel, there was dragging. People dragged things across dirt, stones, and time itself. They carried heavy objects with their backs or placed them on sleds made of wood and hope. They tied ropes around animals, trees, and sometimes each other. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't fast, but it was what they had. There were no rolling carts, no bicycles, no smooth paths or spinning toys, just heavy objects, and the long, painful decision of how to move them from one place to another. And still, for thousands of years, no one thought, maybe we should roll this. Perhaps they were too tired to think. Perhaps they didn't care. Or perhaps they just hadn't stared at a circle long enough. The idea of the wheel didn't arrive quickly. It wasn't a moment of genius like lightning in the brain. It came slowly, like erosion, like boredom, like all things that change the world but aren't noticed at first. People had round things, fruits, stones, logs. They watched things roll down hills, usually by accident, and when it happened, they didn't celebrate. They probably just frowned and walked after it. There is no record of the first person who saw a log roll and said, "Yes, but what if I sat on that?" No ceremony, no statue, just someone, tired of walking, looking at wood with different eyes. The earliest wheels were not wheels at all. They were roundish pieces of nature, used badly. They rolled unevenly, shook constantly, and didn't help much. But still they rolled, and compared to dragging, rolling was something. Eventually someone tried to make a circle on purpose. It wasn't perfect, but it moved. And in that moment, even if no one said it out loud, the world quietly shifted. Of course, the real irony is that the wheel didn't change everything right away. For years, even after inventing it, people didn't use it much. There were no smooth roads, no solid axles, no rubber tires or fancy bearings, just heavy wooden circles and a lot of noise. But that's how it always begins, not with excitement, but with awkwardness. The wheel wasn't born ready. It had to stumble, squeak, and splinter first. And humanity, as always, had to learn how to roll before it could truly move forward. The first wheels were not fast. They were not smooth, they were not efficient, and in many ways they were not even helpful. But they were round, and that apparently was enough to get started. When we imagine the wheel today, we picture something elegant, thin, circular, balanced, a clean shape that spins easily, almost without effort. But the original wheel, the first wheel ever built by human hands, looked nothing like that. It was a thick, solid disc of wood, chopped from the trunk of a tree and shaped with more hope than geometry. It didn't turn well, it didn't turn fast, it didn't turn for long. But it turned. Barely. And that was something. Early wheels were so heavy that moving them became its own kind of labor. To roll a wheel meant lifting it, shoving it, and praying it didn't fall over. They cracked, they wobbled, they stuck to the mud, they rolled downhill when you didn't want them to, and refused to move when you did. They were attached to wooden carts, if you could call them carts. Boxes, really. Boxes with handles, boxes on circles, boxes that made noise, a lot of noise. The wheels didn't rotate around an axle like they do today. Instead, the wheel and axle were often one solid piece, a single wooden rod running through two wooden discs, all locked together in glorious inefficiency. This meant that to move forward, the entire system had to spin as one massive object. The axle didn't help the wheel turn. The axle was the wheel, which meant turning a corner was an adventure in resistance. Imagine trying to roll two entire trees attached by a log across dirt. That's innovation, that's progress, that's pain. But humans are nothing if not persistent. They kept rolling these enormous contraptions because, frankly, it still beat dragging a pile of rocks by hand. Not by much, but just enough.
The real irony is that the wheel
This invention we now consider revolutionary was largely ignored for a long time after its birth. Why? Because it required roads, and roads required cooperation, and early humans weren't particularly famous for their willingness to cooperate. So the wheel was invented and then waited. It waited while people continued to walk. It waited while people continued to carry. It waited while mud swallowed every attempt to use it. And still, slowly, it spread. Meanwhile, the first successful application of the wheel wasn't transportation, it was pottery. Not wagons, not carts, not vehicles, just clay being spun in place by a rotating disc to make cups and bowls. So when humanity met the wheel, its first great achievement was making slightly rounder soup. That was our beginning. Not speed, not movement, just spinning mud. The first pottery wheels were hand-powered, made of stone, and rotated slowly, very slowly, while the potter shaped the clay with quiet concentration. And it worked. It didn't go anywhere, but it worked. This small, stationary act became the model for everything that followed. The wheel would become the thing that moved us, but only after it had spent years not moving at all. Eventually, someone had the idea. If we can spin a lump of wet dirt, maybe we can spin ourselves. A strange conclusion, perhaps, but a useful one. From there, the wheel made its slow, clunky entry into transportation. It started with sleds, modified to accept wheels. Sleds that still barely worked, but now made more noise. Then came carts, boxes on wheels, pulled by animals that didn't ask for this responsibility. These carts didn't turn easily. They didn't ride smoothly. They didn't handle hills well. But they gave the illusion of progress, and sometimes illusion is enough. Still, it would take centuries for the wheel to become more than a novelty. For most people, it remained strange, fragile, and difficult to use. Stones rolled more reliably. Animals carried more weight. And walking, while unpleasant, was at least predictable. But something about the wheel kept us coming back. It had potential. It had symmetry. And maybe, just maybe, it made us feel clever. We didn't fully understand what we had built, but we knew we had built something. And in a world without engines, electricity, or instruction manuals, that was good enough. So the wheel continued. Round, imperfect, loud, and deeply inconvenient, but also unstoppable. Because once something starts rolling, it's hard to make it stop. When people talk about the wheel, they often speak with admiration, celebrating it as one of the most important inventions in human history, a perfect symbol of progress, of movement, of everything that keeps going forward. They say it changed everything, from transportation to trade, from agriculture to war. And while much of that may be true, there's something curiously incomplete about the story. Because for all the praise the wheel receives, there is one piece of the puzzle that is almost always forgotten, overlooked, or simply ignored. The axle. The axle never rolls into the spotlight. It does not sparkle in historical documentaries. It is not etched into cave walls or carved into statues. But without it, the wheel would never have worked. It would have been nothing more than a loose disc, rolling off into the distance, uncontrolled and unpredictable. Unable to support weight or direction, or any real usefulness. The axle gave the wheel structure. It gave it purpose. It made the wheel into something more than an idea. It made it into a tool. In its most basic form, the axle is a fixed rod that holds the wheel in place while allowing it to rotate. That's it. Nothing poetic, nothing fancy, just a functional piece of material that doesn't move so that something else can. And somehow, that simple design has remained relevant for thousands of years, from ancient carts pulled by tired oxen to high-speed trains crossing continents. The axle is always there, reliable, unchanging, and almost completely unacknowledged. The earliest axles were not particularly elegant. They were carved from wood, usually by hand, and lacked any sense of balance or precision. These axles were often fixed to the wheel itself, turning together as one heavy, clumsy unit. There was no separation between stillness and motion. Everything moved at once, and the result was something that worked, but barely. Carts would shake, wheels would grind. The noise was constant, the friction overwhelming. But compared to dragging everything on the ground, it was still an improvement. Eventually, someone had the idea to separate the axle from the wheel, to allow the wheel to spin freely while the axle remained stationary. That small adjustment changed everything. It introduced the concept of rotational independence, which meant smoother rides, less wear, and greater control. But it also meant that the axle would now take on a new role, not just as a structural component, but as the silent support system for everything that moved. Friction became the next great challenge. With wood rubbing against wood, or later wood against metal, the resulting heat and wear threatened to undo the entire system. People began applying rudimentary lubricants, animal fat, plant oils, water, anything that might reduce the grinding and extend the life of the components. These early experiments were crude but surprisingly effective, and they laid the foundation for future developments like bushings and ball bearings, which would come centuries later. Still, the axle didn't ask for much. It didn't require innovation for the sake of fame. It was content to evolve slowly, quietly, in the background of human progress. Even as wheels became more advanced, more aerodynamic, more aesthetically refined, the axle remained a humble cylinder. We often forget that every turning wheel requires something unmoving at its center. Without that fixed point, the rotation becomes chaos. There's no balance, no orientation, no control. The axle provides the calm in the middle of the storm, the stability in the center of motion. It is, quite literally, the axis upon which everything turns. In modern vehicles, the axle continues to play the same quiet role. It holds the wheels of our cars, our bikes, our trains, even our furniture. Office chairs spin because of tiny axles hidden within their bases. Airplanes land on wheels supported by reinforced axles that no one ever sees. Even in places where we least expect them, axles are there, turning nothing, holding everything. But despite its omnipresence, the axle is rarely appreciated. People praise the speed of a bicycle, the smoothness of a luxury car, the elegance of a vintage carriage. But few pause to consider the simple rod at the center of it all, the one that bears the weight, absorbs the stress, and never asks to be noticed. And maybe that's part of the lesson, that sometimes the most useful parts of any system are the ones that remain in place, doing their job with quiet efficiency, never drawing attention, never demanding thanks. When an axle fails, the result is immediate and catastrophic. The wheel wobbles, then collapses. The vehicle veers off course. The system breaks. Only then, in that moment of failure, do we remember how much depended on something we never even thought about. It's a humbling realization that everything we take for granted is held together by something we barely acknowledge. In a way, the axle mirrors the people who quietly hold up the world, those who work behind the scenes, who don't crave attention, who simply do what needs to be done so others can move forward. The axle is a metaphor, if you're in the mood for one. But even if you're not, it's still a marvel of understated design. And so, while the wheel gets the glory, while it spins and dazzles and leads the way into history books and symbolic metaphors, the axle remains behind, still strong and entirely necessary. It does not chase the spotlight. It does not compete. It just continues to exist at the center of it all, as it always has. And perhaps, next time you see a wheel turning smoothly beneath a vehicle or chair or cart, you might take a quiet moment to appreciate the simple truth. None of it would work without the axle. Long before comfortable chairs were placed behind steering wheels, and long before padded seats were attached to buses and trains, there was a far more primitive but revolutionary idea, one that would forever change the way humans experience distance. The concept of sitting, while something else did the moving. At first, the idea must have felt unnatural. Walking was normal. Carrying your own weight was expected. Sitting was something people did when the journey was over, not during it. Travel required effort, sweat, strain, and the constant lifting of one foot after another. For thousands of years, this was simply how the world worked. People moved themselves, or, when they couldn't, they dragged things, or asked animals to help. But there was no sitting involved, no comfort, no rest. The cart changed that. It wasn't invented for passengers. In fact, early carts were entirely utilitarian, meant for carrying things, not people. They were crude boxes on wheels, pulled by animals, who likely had very little say in the matter. These carts carried firewood, sacks of grain, bundles of hay, sometimes stones or clay or meat. They were rattly, noisy, and completely unsuited for comfort. But eventually, someone climbed in. Not out of laziness, perhaps, but out of necessity. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they were injured. Maybe they were simply curious. And just like that, movement was no longer a chore. It was a ride. Of course, those early rides were anything but smooth. The wheels were solid, made of heavy wood. The roads were unpaved, uneven, and unforgiving. There was no suspension, no cushion, no shock absorber. Sitting in a moving cart was an experience that involved every bone in the body, every bump in the road, and every regret about the decision to climb aboard. But despite the discomfort, people didn't stop doing it. They sat, they rode, they endured. Because even the worst ride was better than walking 50 miles on foot. The cart gave way to the wagon, a more refined version of the same idea, larger, sturdier, sometimes covered with fabric to block the sun or rain. The wagon was not just for cargo anymore. It became a place for families, for travelers, for merchants, and migrants. Sitting in a wagon was still not glamorous, but it offered something priceless, the ability to move without moving your legs. And with that came a subtle shift in the way people understood travel. Distance no longer depended solely on energy. It depended on wheels and animals and eventually engines. But before all that, it depended on something simpler, the decision to sit and be carried. The invention of sitting while moving introduced something profoundly human, the desire for comfort during transition. No longer content with simply arriving, people began to care about how they got there. Was the cart smooth? Was it covered? Could it carry more people? Could it carry them faster? As these questions emerged, so did new designs. 4 wheels instead of 2, wider axles, larger platforms, the addition of reins, brakes, and benches. The humble cart evolved into the carriage, the chariot, the coach. Each one added a layer of sophistication. Each one brought humanity closer to what we now call transportation. But the essence remained the same. People sitting still while the world moved beneath them. For the animals pulling these vehicles, the evolution was perhaps less exciting. Horses, oxen, donkeys, and mules continued to bear the burden, often without fanfare. Their role remained unchanged: to convert food into motion, to turn wheels with muscle, to carry not just people, but their expectations of speed and reliability. For them, the cart was not a symbol of innovation. It was a reminder that the wheel may turn, but someone still has to push it. And yet, despite the bumps, the bruises, and the heavy reliance on animal labor, the concept of mobile seating caught on. In cities, carts turned into market stalls on wheels. In the countryside, they became moving homes. In war, they became mobile weapon platforms. And in everyday life, they became the first true taste of what it meant to move without effort. It's strange to think that something as mundane as sitting could represent such a monumental shift in human experience. But in truth, it marked the beginning of a mindset that would later define entire civilizations. The moment we chose to sit and be moved, we invited technology to take over the task of effort. We began designing systems not just for utility but for ease, not just for motion but for comfort in motion. Of course, the comfort would take time. For centuries, carts and wagons remained noisy, jarring, and borderline dangerous. A wrong turn could topple an entire load. A broken axle could leave a traveler stranded for days. Wheels cracked. Roads vanished. Rain turned paths into mud. Still, people chose the cart over the long walk every time, because it was movement with dignity, even if your spine disagreed. And slowly, as materials improved and roads became more than trails worn into the earth, the experience of riding began to transform. Wooden wheels became iron-rimmed, carts gained springs, wagons added covers. Journeys that once required full-day marches became something one could do sitting down, with the occasional yawn and a blanket. In many ways, the wagon was the first ancestor of every moving vehicle we know today. The bus, the train, the car, the airplane, all owe their existence to that first humble cart, pulled by a reluctant animal, carrying a tired human who for once didn't have to walk. And while we've come a long way, while our seats now recline, heat up, and vibrate on command, it's worth remembering that it all started with a wooden box, a pair of wheels, and the simple, profound realization that the human body prefers to sit when it can. The invention of the cart didn't just bring us mobility, it brought us a new kind of rest, one that doesn't wait until the destination is reached, but accompanies us along the way. It is, perhaps, the most overlooked luxury of all. There is something oddly reassuring about the rhythm of a road. The soft repetition of tires or hooves against the ground, the quiet rumble of movement, the feeling of being gently carried forward, these things seem natural now. Familiar, expected. But for most of human history, roads were anything but smooth. They were unpredictable, unpleasant, and often indistinguishable from the surrounding earth. In fact, it took thousands of years for humanity to look at a bumpy path and ask the simple question, should this feel better? The earliest roads weren't really roads at all. They were trails, worn not by design but by repetition, created by feet, by animals, by the slow erosion of habit. 1,000 footsteps do something to the earth. They press it down, flattening the grass, compacting the dirt, and over time, the place where people walk becomes the path that others follow, not because it was built for them, but because it's already there. And when you're traveling on foot, convenience often wins over comfort. But paths, even well-worn ones, are not roads. They are vulnerable to weather. When it rains, they become mud. When it's dry, they become dust. When the wind blows, they disappear beneath leaves and sand. They are temporary, inconsistent, always at the mercy of the environment. The invention of wheeled vehicles, those wooden carts and wagons pulled by animals, changed the relationship between people and the ground beneath them. Suddenly, the surface mattered more, because every rock, every root, every dip in the soil was felt not just beneath a traveler's feet, but through the wooden frame of a cart, through its iron wheels, through every bone and joint of whoever had chosen to ride. And so began the long, slow, reluctant process of trying to improve the surface of the earth. Early attempts at road making were modest. People threw down stones in muddy areas to stop carts from sinking. They laid logs side by side, what some called corduroy roads, hoping the wheels would bounce rather than sink. But these efforts were isolated, reactive, and crude. They weren't infrastructure. They were temporary patches, placed out of frustration, not foresight. The Romans were among the first to take roads seriously. They didn't just clear paths, they engineered them. Layered stone, compacted gravel, precisely graded angles to allow water to drain. The roads were straight, purposeful, and surprisingly durable. Some still exist today, quietly stretching across hills and fields, like memories too stubborn to fade. But these roads were not built for comfort. They were built for conquest, for armies, for empire. Their greatness was not in their softness, but in their permanence. They connected cities, they enabled control, they moved soldiers and supplies, and in doing so they gave structure to entire civilizations. After the fall of Rome, the art of road building declined. Centuries passed, where the idea of maintaining a road felt excessive, like a luxury society couldn't afford. Paths returned to nature, muddy tracks reappeared, carts struggled once more. And for many people, this was simply accepted. Travel was supposed to be uncomfortable. That was the cost of distance. And for most, the destination mattered more than the experience of getting there. It wasn't until trade began to rise, until goods needed to move faster and farther, that people rediscovered the value of a better road. Merchants needed smoother routes, caravans needed predictability, and cities needed connection. Still, improvements were slow. Some towns taxed travelers to maintain roads, others ignored the problem entirely. Many roads were built and forgotten in the same generation. Potholes were patched with whatever was nearby: dirt, wood, straw, even trash. The introduction of cobblestone in urban areas brought some relief. Stones, tightly packed, created a surface that resisted erosion. But they weren't smooth. They clattered under wheels, they jarred every step of a horse, and they turned slick with rain, dangerous with ice. Yet they lasted, and in a world where permanence was rare, that alone was enough. The real transformation didn't begin until the arrival of something faster than a horse, something that demanded smoothness, not as a luxury, but as a requirement: the bicycle. In the late 19th century, bicycles became popular, and unlike carts, they couldn't bounce their way over broken stones. They needed flatness, continuity, consistency. And suddenly, smooth roads were no longer a dream, they were a demand. Cyclists organized, they petitioned governments, they funded improvements. Their movement gave birth to what we now know as paved roads. And then came the automobile, and with it, a new obsession: speed. Cars didn't tolerate inconsistency. They needed roads that were flat, dry, and predictable, day after day, mile after mile. And so governments began to pave, first in cities, then in suburbs, then across entire nations. Asphalt replaced stone. Concrete followed. But even then, the idea of a perfectly smooth ride remained elusive. Roads cracked, they buckled, they aged, and so maintenance became a permanent task, a constant battle between use and decay. Today we take smooth roads for granted. We expect silence beneath our tires, gentle curves, reliable signs. But the truth is, every inch of pavement is a victory over nature. Every mile requires attention, labor, and planning. And even now, perfection remains just out of reach. Smoothness is not natural. It is an ongoing decision, one that must be made again and again, by engineers, by cities, by those who believe that the experience of getting somewhere matters just as much as the arrival itself. The evolution of roads is not just about transportation, it's about expectation, what we tolerate, what we improve, and what we consider essential. Once, it was enough to walk through mud. Then, it was enough to bounce in a wagon. Now, anything less than a silent ride feels like failure. And maybe that says more about us than about the roads themselves. There was once a time when every message needed a mouth, and every delivery required a heartbeat. Words had to be carried, not by wires or waves, but by the bodies of people. People who walked or ran or rode animals across the endless face of the earth. Every note, every thought, every decree, no matter how small, had to be physically transported because ideas back then did not travel on their own. They needed legs. In those early days, communication was not something you sent. It was something you became. The messenger and the message were inseparable. If you wanted your voice heard in the next village, your only real option was to go there yourself, speak to someone directly, and trust that the sound of your words, once spoken, would settle somewhere useful in the listener's mind. The idea of writing something down, sealing it in paper, handing it off to another human being, and trusting it would reach its destination, that required a kind of belief most people didn't yet have. But slowly, society changed. Distances widened, cities grew, kings wanted to rule lands they had never walked, and traders sought to sell goods in markets they would never visit. And so, humanity did what it always does. It built a system to replace itself. If you could not go somewhere in person, you could still be present. In writing, in parchment, in the inked echo of your thoughts. Thus, the letter became a kind of ambassador, a piece of you traveling without you, making your voice heard in rooms where your feet had never stood. At first, the system was fragile. There were no envelopes, no stamps, no formal routes, just a person, a destination, and the hope that the contents of the message would survive the journey better than the body that carried it. Messengers often faced hunger, theft, storms, wild animals, or worse, human indifference. Sometimes the letter arrived, sometimes it didn't, and people accepted this uncertainty not as a flaw in the system, but as a simple truth of living in a world where most things were beyond their control. Over time, trust required structure. Kingdoms formed courier systems. Empires built relay stations. Messages began to flow not randomly, but along predefined paths. Paths carved not by convenience, but by conquest and necessity. Horses were stabled at regular intervals. Riders were trained, replaced, tracked. What was once an errand became a duty, and what was once a favor became a service. The messenger stopped being just a person and became something else, a moving part in a larger machine. And the letters, they multiplied. They became records, instructions, reports, declarations. Not just expressions of affection or longing, but tools of governance. Logistics, it turned out, was not born in a marketplace. It was born in a war room. It was born when rulers realized they could not rule what they could not reach. Still, for centuries, this infrastructure served only the powerful. Most people did not send letters. Most people never received them. A farmer might live his entire life without ever holding a sealed message in his hands. The post was a system designed for kings, generals, tax collectors, and eventually merchants. Only much later would it become a system for ordinary people. And yet, something shifted. As printing spread, as education reached more homes, as paper grew cheaper and pens more common, people began to write. Not because they had something important to say, but because they had something human to share. Letters became personal, romantic, mundane, a woman writing to her sister, a father writing to his son, a child writing to someone they would never meet. And in that quiet shift from transactional to emotional, the postal system transformed into something deeper. A way not just to send information, but to maintain connection. The act of writing became ritual, folding paper, sealing envelopes, licking stamps, dropping the letter into a box and walking away, knowing you might wait days or weeks before hearing back, if you heard back at all. There was patience in that process, a kind of faith, a belief that somewhere a stranger would carry your words with care. But as the speed of life increased, so did the nature of delivery. Messages were no longer enough. People wanted objects, items, things, and not just important things, anything. If it could be boxed, bagged, wrapped, or folded, someone wanted it moved. From one house to another, from one store to another, from one continent to another. And so delivery turned into a profession, not just a favor, not just a royal task, but an industry. Packages began to replace people as the things that moved most often. Warehouses appeared, labels multiplied, routes were calculated not for beauty or safety, but for efficiency. Trucks replaced horses, planes replaced trains, barcodes replaced handwriting. And in the middle of it all, human beings became something else. Because once you start designing a system that moves packages, you eventually start applying the same logic to people. A traveler on a plane is not so different from a parcel on a truck. Both require space, weight limits, fuel, and paperwork. Both follow a schedule, a route, a destination. Both are scanned, sorted, and tracked. And when something goes wrong, a delay, a misplacement, a cancellation, both receive the same treatment. A message, a number, an apology. You are not a package. But the system treats you like one, and strangely, you accept it. We now expect to move like objects, smoothly, quickly, without friction. We check in at terminals and stand in queues. We wait for boarding, like crates waiting to be loaded. We strap ourselves into rows of identical seats. We are not thrown across the sky, we are shipped. And this has changed the way we think. We no longer consider distance a barrier. A box of shoes from another country, a bottle of shampoo from across the state, a phone made thousands of miles away. If we want it, we expect it. And if it doesn't arrive on time, we feel something close to betrayal. But logistics was never about convenience. It was about control. Every successful delivery is the result of 1,000 small decisions made by hands you will never shake, in buildings you will never enter, under lights that never turn off. Forklifts gliding silently across concrete floors, pallets stacked in quiet symmetry, workers with tired backs, barcodes flashing beneath scanner lights. A ballet of movement, uncelebrated but essential. And this movement, invisible to most, creates the illusion of effortlessness. We click, we wait, we receive, but in between, things happen. Tires wear down, drivers lose sleep, machines hum without rest, and yet we remain disconnected from all of it. We see only the final step, the box on the porch, the envelope in the slot. We forget the journey, and we rarely thank the traveler. Still, the system continues. It delivers not just goods, but expectations. It teaches us to want faster, to wait less, to feel entitled to everything immediately. And in doing so, it turns patience into a flaw and delay into a failure. But maybe, just maybe, there's something sacred in the waiting, something deeply human in the act of trusting a system you cannot see, full of people you will never meet, all working quietly to bring you something you may not even need. Because sometimes, what we're really shipping isn't a product. It's a hope, a reassurance, a belief that the world is still connected, even in silence, that movement still happens, even in the dark, that someone, somewhere, is still carrying something for you. Long before plastic bottles and sealed containers, before the convenience of disposable packaging and resealable lids, human beings faced a remarkably simple but surprisingly persistent challenge. Things spill. Liquids don't stay put. Grains roll, oil leaks, water seeps. Nature, for all its elegance and abundance, refuses to cooperate with our need for containment. We pour something into a space, and it pours right back out again. The earth offers no lids, the wind offers no walls. And so, from the very beginning, our relationship with storage has been defined by one recurring concern: how to make things stay where we want them. It began with hands, of course, the most ancient of containers. Cupped together, fingers forming temporary walls, palms gently cradling water from a stream or seeds from a tree. But hands, for all their dexterity, are not reliable containers. They tremble, they open, they empty, they cannot be sealed, they cannot be trusted with heat or time or distance. And so early humans looked around and found in nature some rough ideas: shells, hollow stones, animal horns, woven baskets, dried gourds, objects that could hold something, at least for a little while. The first buckets were not made, they were found. Nature offered its shapes, and humans simply repurposed them. But soon that wasn't enough. The needs became larger. Water had to be moved from a river to a home. Grain had to be stored through winter. Oil had to be transported across villages. And the fragility of natural containers became a limitation. A gourd cracks, a shell breaks, a woven basket leaks. So we began to craft. Clay was one of the earliest answers. It could be shaped, dried, hardened. It could be made round, wide, deep, and perhaps most importantly, it could be sealed. Fired clay gave rise to jars, pots, amphorae, vessels not only designed to hold things, but to protect them. And so a new idea entered the human world, not just to carry, but to preserve. A container was no longer just a tool, it became a safeguard, a defense against spoilage, theft, contamination, and time itself. In every ancient civilization, there are signs of this obsession. Pottery shards in Egyptian tombs, storage jars in Mesopotamian ruins, amphorae dredged from the bottom of the Mediterranean, all echoing the same concern. This must not spill, this must be kept, this must remain. And then, at some point, someone built a barrel. A curious invention. Unlike pots, which were static and fragile, barrels could be moved, it could be rolled, and because they were made of wood, they could bounce, shift, and endure long journeys. Wooden staves bent into a gentle curve, bound together by metal hoops, sealed tightly at the top and bottom, not with glue or nails, but with pressure, fit, and tradition. The barrel was not just a container, it was a mobile vault, and in a time before forklifts and plastic wrap, that made it revolutionary. Barrels carried wine, oil, gunpowder, nails, salt, spices. They sailed across oceans, they rolled down docks, they stood upright in cellars, aging the contents within, whispering flavors into the liquid through the pores of the wood. And yet, even now, we don't give them much thought. A bucket, a barrel, a crate, just objects, just things. But they are more than that. They are invisible solutions to invisible problems. How do you keep water from evaporating? How do you stop food from spoiling? How do you move 20 liters of something heavy and fragile without spilling it all? You invent the container. And then you forget it exists. That's the great irony of packaging. The better it works, the less we notice it. We see the wine, we admire the perfume, we use the oil, but we forget the vessel. We forget that someone spent centuries figuring out how to shape it, how to seal it, how to make it work again and again for strangers in faraway places. In the modern world, containment feels trivial. We have endless solutions: Tupperware, glass jars, vacuum-sealed pouches, plastic tanks, metal drums, flexible bags with zip-locks. But this abundance creates blindness. We stop seeing the problem, and with it, we stop appreciating the answer. The truth is, every time you pour something and it doesn't spill, that's a tiny miracle. Every time you open a cap and find the contents fresh, usable, safe, that's not luck. That's thousands of years of human trial and error, of leaks, of failures, of broken jars and soggy floors, of spoiled grain and vanished oil. We think of progress as technology, but sometimes it's just better barrels. Think for a moment about a simple wooden bucket. It seems primitive, obsolete, yet its shape persists. Why? Because it works. The circle is strong. The vertical sides hold more volume. The handle allows lifting. The materials can be repaired, replaced, recycled. A bucket doesn't boast. It doesn't evolve. It endures. Even now, when we build digital cities and orbit satellites, we still use barrels to age wine. We still use buckets to clean floors. We still depend on containers to hold what matters. Not because we can't improve them, but because in some quiet way they were already right. And this is where containment becomes philosophy. To contain something is to define it, to give it a boundary, a shape, a rule. The same liquid, when spilled across a floor, is a mess. But when contained in a glass, it becomes purposeful, controlled, useful. In this way, containers do more than hold. They give meaning. They tell the contents, this is your place. You belong here. You begin and end within this space. And perhaps, on some level, we crave the same. A room with 4 walls, a calendar with dates, a sentence with punctuation, all ways of holding something that might otherwise spill into chaos. We are, in some strange way, also containers. Our bodies hold thoughts. Our skin holds warmth. Our minds hold memories that would otherwise scatter like dust. So maybe that's why the barrel matters, not just for wine, not just for oil, but as a symbol of how we take the chaos of the world and give it shape. At some point in history, quietly without ceremony or applause, someone decided that one thing should be exactly as long as another, that a bolt should match a nut, that a lid should fit a jar, that the width of a door frame should correspond to the width of the cart that passed through it. And that decision, small, practical, forgettable, changed the shape of everything that came after. It is not a dramatic story. There was no revolution, no war for symmetry, no global summit on dimensions. Standardization crept in slowly, as a whisper, as a convenience, and then, eventually, as a necessity. We didn't start with boxes that fit. We started with chaos, with containers that didn't stack, screws that didn't match, wheels that didn't fit their axles. But piece by piece, inch by inch, the world began to settle into rhythm. At first, it was trade that demanded it. When you sell cloth in rolls, or flour in sacks, or nails in weight, your customer expects a certain consistency. A yard of cloth should be the same length, no matter who cuts it. A pound of salt should weigh the same, whether you buy it in one town or the next. And so measurement was born, not as science, but as fairness. Of course, these measurements varied wildly. One village's foot could be another's forearm. The length of a stride might depend on who was doing the walking. The width of a barrel might reflect the shape of a tree more than any agreed-upon design. But even this chaos had order. Each community knew its own units. The confusion only came when people crossed borders, or when merchants traded across oceans. So slowly, painfully, we began to agree. A meter, a liter, a kilogram, numbers carved into brass rods, standards stored in vaults, definitions refined by light, by atoms, by time itself, and from those agreements, everything else followed. Because once you agree on how long something is supposed to be, you can start building a world that fits together. You can make shelves that hold identical jars. You can make trucks that carry pallets, that carry boxes, that carry goods, all perfectly aligned. You can make doors that fit frames, windows that fit walls, screws that fit holes. Standardization, though invisible, is everywhere. Your bed fits your sheets. Your phone fits your charger. Your books fit your shelf. Your fork fits your hand. And we rarely think about why. We assume the world is made to fit us, but really, we have been made to fit the world we built. Consider the shipping container, a simple metal box, 8 feet wide, 8.5 feet tall, and either 20 or 40 feet long. These dimensions were not chosen for beauty, they were chosen because they worked. They could be stacked on ships, loaded by cranes, carried by trucks, and stored in warehouses. The container became the unit not of weight, but of space. A global building block, and because it worked so well, everything else bent around it. Ships were redesigned, ports were rebuilt, trains were adjusted, highways were widened, all for the sake of the box. This is the power of a standard. It is not imposed, it is accepted. Slowly, universally, and then it becomes invisible. You stop noticing that your light bulbs screw in the same way, that your paper is always 8.5 by 11 inches, that your shoelaces fit through eyelets, spaced just far enough apart. And once something is standard, we begin to optimize for it. Warehouse shelves are built to hold specific box sizes. Manufacturing machines are calibrated to cut exact shapes. Even our packaging, those sealed plastic trays, those folded cardboard inserts, those clamshells that are impossible to open, are all designed not just to hold a product, but to fit perfectly into shipping crates, into trucks, into time. Efficiency has become geometry. Profit has become packaging. But there's a strange consequence to all of this. As the world becomes more efficient, it also becomes more similar. Walk into a supermarket in Japan or Brazil or Germany, and you will find that the cereal boxes are not wildly different in size. Open a drawer in a hotel room in Canada or France, and the hangers will likely work just the same. Buy a chair online, and it will arrive in a flat box ready to be assembled with a hex key that fits screws identical to those used in thousands of other pieces of furniture. The same, over and over again, by design. And while this makes our lives easier, it also makes them predictable. Everything fits, but nothing surprises. We no longer wonder if something will work. We assume it will, because it must, because that's what standards are for. And yet, there's something quietly fascinating about this invisible conformity. The coffee cup that slides effortlessly into your car's cup holder, the laptop that fits perfectly into your backpack, the phone case that wraps around your device like a second skin. All of them were designed by people you'll never meet, and yet they knew exactly what you would need, because someone, somewhere, had already agreed on the size of things. And so, we live in a world of quiet coordination. Factories in different countries, operated by different companies, staffed by different people, all working toward the same invisible measurements. An orchestra without a conductor. A choreography without a stage. Everything timed, everything aligned, everything packed into a box. It might feel sterile or impersonal, but it is also miraculous, because when everything fits, things move faster, goods reach you sooner, waste is reduced, and the chaos of scale becomes the calm of precision. Still, there's a part of the mind that resists it, that longs for the uneven, the handmade, the object that doesn't quite fit anywhere, a chair that wobbles slightly, a cup that's too wide for the shelf, a drawer that sticks when it's humid. Imperfection, the mark of a thing not built to standard, but to feel. But in a world designed for speed, those imperfections become liabilities. You can't stack them, you can't ship them easily, you can't predict them, and so they disappear, replaced by sameness, by size, by the box that holds them all. It's hard to imagine a world without wheels, not because they are extraordinary, but because they are everywhere. And perhaps that's the point. Their genius is so complete, so quiet, so effective that we barely notice them at all. They are not admired, they are assumed. And yet, their arrival was not inevitable. The wheel was not discovered, it was invented. And that invention changed how far we could go, how fast we could move, and how close the world could feel. Before wheels, everything was friction. If you wanted to move something, you dragged it. Across grass, across sand, across stone. The bigger the load, the more muscle it required. Logs were used sometimes to roll heavy stones, but it was temporary. They moved beneath the weight and had to be repositioned constantly. The idea of something that rolled with the object rather than under it did not appear right away. There was no obvious model in nature, no animals with wheels, no seeds shaped like spinning discs. The idea was unnatural. And yet it arrived. The first wheel wasn't part of a machine. It was a concept, a round piece of wood, a shape that could spin. But it was useless on its own. A wheel without an axle is just a plate, and an axle without a bearing is just a stick. The brilliance of the wheel was not in the circle, it was in the combination of parts, the axle, the hub, the shaft, the frame, all working in harmony to allow something to move forward while staying upright. It was not a discovery of form, it was a discovery of function. And once we understood it, we couldn't go back. Carts replaced sleds, wagons replaced shoulders, goods could be moved farther, soldiers could travel faster, entire cities could grow outward, knowing they could import what they could not produce. The wheel turned, and with it, civilization. But this didn't happen overnight. The wheel was delicate at first, made of solid wood, prone to cracking, heavy, limited. Roads were not built to accommodate it. Trails were muddy, rocky, unpredictable. A wheel, to be useful, needed a smooth path, and so we built them. Roads of stone, paths of gravel, flat stretches of ground where before there had only been wilderness. Movement became infrastructure. And as the roads improved, so did the wheels. Solid discs became spoked wheels, lighter, faster, less prone to breaking. Wooden rims were wrapped with metal to reduce wear. Axles became greased, bearings were invented, suspension was introduced, springs and shock absorbers, seats and steering. And with each improvement, the world shrank. Because when it takes 3 weeks to reach a city, that city feels distant. But when it takes 3 hours, it feels near. Not because the miles have changed, but because the time has. The wheel did not reduce geography, it reduced experience. It made far places feel close. It made foreign goods familiar. It made strangers into neighbors. And it kept spinning. From carts to carriages, from wagons to locomotives, from bicycles to cars, from cars to planes. The principle remained. A wheel rotates, a surface turns, something moves forward. And inside that motion, the world bends inward. Mail arrives from distant countries, goods are delivered to your door, friends live across the continent and you see them before dinner, because the wheel turned. It is perhaps the most successful invention in human history, not because it does one thing well, but because it has done so many things well, for so long, without needing to be reinvented. Even now, with all our computers and codes, with artificial intelligence and self-driving systems, the wheel remains unchanged. A round thing that rolls, that carries us forward. But the more it succeeded, the more invisible it became. When you see a car, you don't marvel at the wheels. You marvel at the paint, the glass, the technology, the features, but not the wheels. You trust them. You expect them. You forget they are there. And yet, if a single wheel goes flat, the entire machine becomes useless. One missing circle and the illusion of movement collapses. That's the paradox of progress. The most important parts are often the ones we don't see anymore. The wheel did not make us faster by itself. It allowed us to build systems that made us faster. It enabled roads, it enabled trade, it enabled machines, and eventually it enabled the clock itself. Because once you can move quickly, you begin to measure how quickly you move. Hours, minutes, seconds, schedules are born, deadlines appear, time zones are introduced. Trains must leave exactly on time because someone in another city is waiting. A factory must receive its materials on the third day, not the fourth. A plane must land at 6:02, not 6:15. The wheel, in a quiet way, gave us punctuality. It gave us distance that could be measured. And with that, it gave us anxiety. Because now we know how late we are. Now we know how far behind we've fallen. Now we know how fast others are moving. The wheel gave us motion, but also expectation. And so we spin with it, faster and faster, rushing, racing, accelerating. But maybe, in the middle of all that speed, we forget what it meant. The first wheel was not a machine of urgency. It was a relief, a solution to burden, a way to move something heavy without pain. It was not invented to make you late. It was invented to make life easier, and it still does. Every cart in a grocery store, every suitcase you pull through an airport, every office chair that rolls across a room, they carry your weight. They reduce your effort because someone, thousands of years ago, wondered what would happen if you rolled something instead of lifting it. And now we live in that world. A world where wheels are assumed, where motion is expected, where distance is meaningless. But even as we move faster, and even as we forget the wheel itself, it keeps turning. Beneath us, behind us, underneath it all. Quiet, reliable, constant. Turning the world, one revolution at a time. There's something deeply human about stacking things. We do it without thinking. Books on shelves, boxes in closets, plates in cupboards. It feels organized, contained, safe. But behind this quiet instinct lies an entire system, one that touches everything from global commerce to household routine. And at the heart of it all, there is the palette, a wooden frame, a humble square. Often overlooked, yet foundational to the way we live. It does not move on its own. It does not shine. It does not attract attention. And yet everything that moves, everything we consume, everything we ship, everything we store, at some point probably sat on a pallet. Think about it. Before it arrived in your home, your television was in a box. That box was one of many. Those boxes were stacked on a pallet. The pallet was lifted by a forklift, loaded into a truck, and carried to a distribution center, where more pallets were waiting, more boxes, more goods, all resting on the same quiet invention. A flat surface, raised just high enough for the prongs of a lift to slide underneath, slats wide enough to support weight, space close enough to keep things from falling through. Uniform in size, standard in shape, interchangeable, predictable. And because of that, it changed everything. Before pallets, goods were moved individually, by hand, by cart, in crates or barrels. It was slow, labor-intensive, messy. And it meant that ships and trains and warehouses had to work around the shapes of random boxes, sacks, and bundles. Loading and unloading took days, sometimes weeks. The pallet brought geometry to chaos. It allowed workers to move entire stacks in one motion. It gave factories a rhythm. It gave warehouses a flow. It made logistics possible. With pallets, Goods could be arranged like building blocks, stacked, counted, wrapped. Loaded and unloaded with machines, scanned and tracked and routed with precision. The world got faster, more efficient, more square. But the palette didn't ask for credit. It didn't put its name on anything. It didn't claim territory or brand loyalty. It just sat there, beneath the goods, doing its job. Wooden ones were first. Cheap, easy to repair, disposable when broken. Then came plastic pallets, durable, washable, reusable. Then metal, used in heavy industries or sterile environments. And now, pallets exist in a quiet hierarchy, defined not by prestige, but by practicality. Some are nestable, some are stackable, some are designed for one trip only, others for 1,000. Some are heat-treated, others are recycled. Some even contain RFID tags to be tracked by satellites and servers across continents. And yet at a glance, they all look the same. Just wood, or plastic, or steel. A flat thing, waiting to be used. But behind that sameness is power. Because pallets decide how things are built. Refrigerators are sized to fit on a pallet. Televisions are boxed to the edges of one. Canned goods, dry food, bottled water, all organized with pallets in mind. Even the dimensions of store shelves, the layout of supermarket aisles, the width of delivery trucks. These are not just human choices. They are pallet choices. Invisible influence. Quiet dominance. And so, without ever asking, the palette became the hidden ruler of space. You won't see it on advertisements, you won't find it in boardrooms, but it's there, beneath it all, holding it all up. And the numbers are staggering. There are over 5 billion pallets in circulation today. Wooden ones dominate, stacked in yards, hidden behind stores, piled in factories. Some last for years, others for only a single trip. Many are lost, abandoned, burned, reused. A black market exists for old pallets. Collectors scavenge them, artists repurpose them. They become tables, beds, garden walls, firewood, even artwork. Because there is something poetic in their simplicity. No moving parts, no circuits, just slats and nails. And yet they move the world. One pallet can carry a ton. 20 pallets fill a truck. A ship might hold 50,000, and every one of them must be accounted for. Because without the pallet, the entire system slows. It's not glamorous, but it's essential. Warehouses are optimized for them, forklifts are built around them, inventory systems rely on them, barcodes are placed for them. And every second, somewhere in the world, a pallet is moved, lifted, rotated, slid, lowered, shifted into a truck, unloaded at a store, dropped onto a warehouse floor, or pushed into a corner, waiting to be used again. And through all of this, it never makes a sound. It doesn't beep. It doesn't shine. It doesn't announce its presence. But it's there. And it is waiting. Waiting to carry something. Waiting to be useful. Waiting to make the world just a little more organized. A little more square. The palette, for all its silence, teaches us something. That the most powerful systems are often the most invisible. That the foundations of progress are not always the loudest or brightest. That sometimes it is the thing that lies beneath. The flat, wooden frame that allows everything above it to rise. And maybe that's a comfort. In a world of complexity, of noise, of disruption, the palette remains. Simple, sturdy, predictable, a quiet partner in the great movement of goods, of needs, of people, of progress. And when you lie in bed at night, listening to the soft hum of distant trucks, or the echo of warehouse doors closing, you may not think of them. But somewhere, in the back of it all, a pallet has done its job, and the world has turned one more time. It's just a box. That's how it looks. Rectangular, steel, ribbed along the sides, painted in dull industrial colors. Blue, green, rust red, sometimes marked with faded letters, sometimes stacked so high they block the sky. And yet, behind its plain appearance lies a revolution, one that quietly reshaped the entire structure of global trade. Because before the shipping container, goods were moved in pieces. Bags of rice, barrels of oil, crates of furniture, each item handled by hand, loaded one by one, stored in the hulls of ships with ropes and nets and patience. It took days to load a ship, days to unload it. Ports were slow, chaotic, dangerous. Every piece required labor. Every step invited loss, damage, theft. And then, in the 1950s, something changed. Not with a new material, not with new energy, but with a simple idea. What if everything went in a box? A strong box, a uniform box, a box that could be lifted by crane, stacked by machine, locked with a twist, and moved without opening. Enter the shipping container. 40 feet long, 8 feet wide, 8.5 feet tall, a single standard unit, strong enough to support thousands of pounds, simple enough to build by the millions, cheap enough to discard, durable enough to survive the sea. And with that, the world began to move. Factories no longer had to worry about the shape of their goods. Whatever they produced, they could put it in the box. Clothes, tires, books, refrigerators, phones, everything packed and sealed and labeled. The container would handle the rest. No need for separate packaging. No need to resort at the docks. Just fill the box, lock it shut, and send it away. And so, distance changed. Because when it no longer matters if the factory is next door or across the ocean, everything feels closer. Shipping became logistics, warehouses became ports, cities became hubs, and the container, quiet, anonymous, rectangular, became the unit of global motion. It rides ships, it rides trains, it rides trucks, and it never opens until it arrives. Inside, it could be anything: food, medicine, plastic toys, precious metals, 100,000 possibilities. But outside, it looks the same: standardized, sterile, silent. It has no face, no brand, no story on the outside. Only codes, numbers, warnings. But inside, there is always something human, something made by hands, something meant for someone else. And that is the quiet poetry of the container. It hides the world inside itself, stacks the efforts of thousands behind cold steel walls, and delivers them across oceans, through storms, into cities, onto shelves, into homes. A single box, traveling thousands of miles across borders, across languages, across time, but it is not fast, and it is not beautiful. It waits at docks, at warehouses, on trains that crawl across the countryside, on ships that rock in the open sea. It is not the speed of air, it is the rhythm of water, of patience, of scale, because containers don't move alone. They move in groups, hundreds, thousands, entire ships filled with nothing but boxes, stacked 5 high, 10 across, row after row after row, a floating library of sealed chapters. And when they arrive, cranes lift them gently, set them on trains, onto trucks, into hands, and then they disappear again, emptied, returned, reused, because a shipping container is not a destination. It is a path. A vessel of silence, a metal compromise between origin and arrival. And while we rarely see them, tucked behind ports, hidden in industrial zones, they shape the shelves we shop. They shape the prices we pay. They shape the foods we eat, the tools we use, the gifts we give. They are the reason your phone case came from China, the reason your socks were made in Vietnam, the reason your coffee arrived from Colombia. They are the invisible veins of global trade, and the blood they carry is everything we use. And still, they ask for nothing. They are not proud. They do not change. They do not evolve. They only continue. Same shape, same size, same role. A box, just a box, but one that carries the world. And when the wind rises and the ports fall quiet and the cranes stand still, the containers wait. They do not rust with sadness. They do not grow tired. They wait to be filled, to be moved, to be useful once more, because in the story of the modern world, the shipping container is not the hero. It is the stage. And everything else, every product, every person, every plan, is simply passing through. They don't speak. They don't raise their voices. They don't blink or breathe or protest. They don't claim territory or ask to be noticed or need recognition. But they are there. And they are always there. The chair that waits in the corner, the shelf that holds the books we meant to read, the box under the bed filled with things we forgot, the hook on the wall empty and patient, the pallet in a warehouse stacked and still, the wheel that turns unnoticed, the table we set each day not out of ritual but because it is simply there to be used. They are not rare. They are not precious. They are not limited editions nor collectibles, but they are dependable. They are everywhere. They are the silent witnesses of everything we do. A house may be made of walls and roofs, but it is these objects that make it feel real. It is the surface where we place our keys, the hook that keeps our bag off the floor, the seat that takes our weight after a long day, the simple rectangle of a door, the turn of a doorknob, the placement of a step. We live our lives among things, and though we rarely think about them, they carry our stories. Not loudly like books or photographs, but gently, softly, through use, through repetition. There is history in the worn arm of a chair, in the scratches on a tabletop, in the smooth corner of a box, rounded from years of contact. A kind of memory that does not need words, a record of presence. And when we leave a place, it is the absence of these things that we feel first. The room becomes strange without the hook we used. The shelf looks unfamiliar when it is empty. The quiet of a room with no table, no chair, no light on the wall, it feels like silence magnified. because objects ground us, not by their function alone, but by the way they echo the rhythms of our lives. A fork on a plate, a cup in a hand, a stool beside a counter, the tray beneath the cup, the cloth beneath the tray, a cascade of presence, layer upon layer. And they do not demand improvement. They do not grow obsolete in the same way a phone or a screen does. A wheel is still a wheel, a box is still a box, a shelf still holds, a hook still hangs, a pallet still lifts, and a chair still waits. Some are made of wood, some of plastic, some of metal or wire or clay, but their purpose is never loud. It is gentle, reassuring, like a hand resting on your shoulder, like a whisper that says, "You are home." They surround us not to impress, but to serve, and in that service there is a kind of grace, a humility, a quiet strength. They are the frame around the painting of our lives, the backdrop to our mornings, our meals, our conversations. They do not speak, but they allow us to speak. They do not move, but they allow us to rest. They do not shine, but they make space for us to shine. And perhaps the most beautiful part is this: they do not resent being unnoticed. They do not grow jealous of attention. They are content to simply be, to hold, to carry, to wait. When you walk through your day, you pass hundreds of them. The chair in the hallway, the table in the break room, the bin by the door, the cart that rolls, the crate that stores, the bench by the tree, the ramp, the rail, the frame. None of them demand anything. But take one away and you will notice. Try to live without a table. Try to manage without a shelf. Try to carry without a box. And suddenly their absence becomes very loud. It is not that we owe them thanks. They are not alive, but they are part of the pattern, the structure, the choreography of our movement through the world. And when the world feels uncertain, when everything seems fast and fleeting and intangible, it helps to look at the chair, to see its shape, its legs, its weight, to remember that not everything moves. Some things stay. They stay, and they wait, and they support. And in that staying, we find something to lean on. And then, at night, when the lights dim and the world quiets, they remain. The cup on the counter, the book on the table, the hook on the wall, the frame of the door, the desk that watched your day unfold, still there, still serving. And when you sleep, they do not vanish. They do not disappear when unobserved. They remain, faithfully, unchanging, unaffected by your absence, and quietly they wait for morning. That is their power, not in motion, not in innovation, but in stillness. The power of objects is the power of presence, of consistency, of form that endures, of usefulness that does not expire. And so, as we end our journey, through pallets and wheels, hooks and shelves, chairs and containers, we return to the simple truth that the world runs not just on ideas or energy or ambition, but on objects, silent, solid, steady. They are the stage beneath the performance, the quiet instruments behind the music of life. We do not need to worship them, only to notice, to let them remind us that not all strength is loud, that not all importance shines, that some things are essential simply because they are always there. So tonight, when you lie down to sleep and the room grows quiet, look around, even if only in your memory. See the outline of the lamp, the edge of the desk, the curve of the chair, the shape of the doorknob, the box beside the wall, the hook waiting on the door, and know that you are held by things that do not ask to be seen, but that see you and carry you and wait for you always. Good night.